The hum of the spaceship's engines died down as it landed softly on the alien planet. The landscape stretched out in all directions, barren and rugged, with jagged mountains in the distance. A thick layer of dust coated the ground, shifting with the wind as the harsh sun blazed above. The air was thin and dry, typical of the outer rim planets the protagonist often visited. This planet was new, unexplored by most humans, and barely charted on any star maps. The ship's hatch opened, and the protagonist stepped out, their boots crunching on the dusty ground. They looked up at the horizon, taking in the desolate beauty of the place. The distant mountains seemed to glow faintly in the orange light of the twin suns. The planet had no name, only a number. It was a place people avoided, not because it was dangerous, but because it had little to offer. But to the protagonist, that was the appeal. As an experienced explorer and space adventurer, the protagonist had always found the unknown to be a thrill. The quiet, the solitude, the chance to discover something no one had ever seen before. It was the reason they'd taken this journey alone. Their boots kicked up a small cloud of dust as they moved forward, scanning the horizon for any signs of life. The communicator buzzed softly in their ear, but the signal was weak, only static breaking through. No surprise there. This planet was remote, far from any major settlements or known colonies. As they ventured deeper into the desolate landscape, a strange feeling began to settle in. It was as if they were being watched. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up, and their senses sharpened. A shadow moved on the far side of the rocky outcrop ahead. At first, the protagonist thought it was a trick of the light, but then it moved again, faster this time, as if something, or someone, was closing the distance. The protagonist froze, instinctively reaching for the blaster holstered at their side. Before they could pull it free, a figure stepped out from behind the rocks. It was tall, towering even by human standards, clad in dark, gleaming armor that reflected the twin suns above. The figure's face was hidden behind a helmet, but there was no mistaking the strength in their posture, the confidence in their movements. The figure stepped closer, and the protagonist's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just any alien. It was a Thraxian. Thraxians were known throughout the galaxy for their warrior culture. They were fierce, proud, and unyielding in battle. Legends spoke of their prowess, how they could defeat armies with nothing but their bare hands. The protagonist had heard stories about them, but had never encountered one in person. The Thraxian woman towered over them, the heavy armor plate shifting as she moved. She spoke in a voice that carried the weight of authority, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You," she said, her tone cold and commanding, "you are not welcome here." They had encountered dangerous situations before and had always managed to keep their cool. But something about the way this Thraxian spoke made the air feel heavier, thicker. "I'm just passing through," the protagonist said, their voice calm but firm. "I mean no harm." The Thraxian narrowed her eyes, assessing them, with a look that felt like it could pierce through steel. For a long moment, neither moved, the tension between them palpable. Then, without warning, the Thraxian reached for her weapon. Her hand flashed to the hilt of a blade, long and sleek, glinting in the sunlight. She drew it with a fluid motion, the weapon humming with energy. "I don't care if you mean harm," she said, her voice now low and dangerous. "You're on my land." And here we settle things through strength. The protagonist didn't hesitate. They knew this was coming. In the few moments of hesitation, they had already begun calculating their moves. They had always prided themselves on their ability to think quickly, to adapt. It was the reason they had survived so many dangerous encounters across the galaxy. "I don't want to fight," the protagonist said, trying to keep the peace. But it was clear the Thraxian wasn't interested in talking. Without another word, the Thraxian lunged at them. The blade slashed through the air with a hiss, cutting toward the protagonist's chest. The protagonist dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack. The Thraxian was fast, too fast, but the protagonist had seen similar moves before and knew how to counter them. In one smooth motion, they spun around, grabbing the Thoraxian's arm and using her own momentum against her. The warrior grunted as she stumbled, but quickly regained her balance. She swung again, but this time the protagonist was ready, blocking the strike with a well-timed parry. For a moment, they were locked in a battle of wills, the Thoraxian's raw power against the protagonist's agility and precision. The air crackled with the intensity of their movements, the sound of clashing metal ringing out across the empty landscape.
"You're good," the Thoraxian grunted, her voice filled with a grudging respect.
"But you'll need more than that to defeat me." The protagonists didn't respond, their focus entirely on the fight. They dodged and weaved, keeping just out of reach of the Thoraxian's blade. Every movement was calculated, every step precise. This wasn't just a battle of strength, it was a battle of strategy. The protagonist had faced opponents who relied on brute force before, but they had always found a way to outsmart them. But this Thoraxian was different. She was relentless, faster than anyone the protagonist had ever fought. There was no room for error. The fight dragged on, each moment feeling like an eternity. The dust swirled around them as they danced across the battlefield, each strike more powerful than the last. But the protagonist's energy was starting to wane. They needed to end this soon. If the Thoraxian's strength didn't overwhelm them, exhaustion surely would. Then, as if sensing the protagonist's growing fatigue, the Thoraxian paused. She stepped back, lowering her blade, a sharp glint of realization flashing in her eyes. For a moment, the two stood there, facing each other in the stillness. The protagonist felt the weight of her gaze, and their hand instinctively moved to their back. Without thinking, they pulled off their jacket, revealing the tattoo that had been hidden beneath. It was a symbol, an intricate design of sharp lines and curves, marking the protagonist's back like a secret. The Thoraxian's eyes widened as she saw it. Her mouth parted in disbelief, the blade slowly slipping from her fingers as she took a step back. "No, it can't be," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The protagonist watched in confusion as the warrior's expression changed from one of fierce combat to one of shock and awe. "What's wrong?" the protagonist asked, their voice unsure. The Thoraxian didn't answer. Instead, she stared at the tattoo for several long moments, her breath quickening. Slowly, she sank to one knee, her entire demeanor shifting from aggression to reverence. The protagonist's confusion deepened. You are marked," the Thoraxian said in a voice that was both amazed and fearful. "You are the one." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning, but the protagonist could make no sense of them. They didn't know what the Thoraxian meant, but something told them that this tattoo was not just a mark. It was something much larger than they could have imagined. And in that moment, everything changed. The silence between them felt heavy, like a sudden stillness after a storm had passed. The protagonist stood motionless, still processing the shock of the Thoraxian's reaction. They had been expecting hostility, a fight to the death perhaps. But what had just transpired? What was this strange respect in her eyes? The Thoraxian warrior knelt before the protagonist, her head slightly bowed. She wasn't merely acknowledging a fellow warrior. No, this was something deeper, a recognition of fate. Her once aggressive stance was replaced by one of reverence, as if the protagonist were some ancient figure of legend rather than just a wanderer lost in a foreign land. The protagonists shifted uneasily on their feet, unsure of what to make of the situation. "What do you mean, I am the one?" they asked, their voice breaking the stillness. The Thoraxian slowly rose to her feet, her gaze still locked on the protagonist's back, where the tattoo was now fully exposed. She seemed lost in thought for a moment, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. The protagonist couldn't help but notice the way her posture changed, the way she seemed to hold herself with more control, more respect than before. "It is the mark of the forgotten warrior," the Thoraxian finally said, her voice lower now as though speaking of something sacred. "A symbol of the one who was foretold to end the endless war of our people." She paused for a moment, her eyes narrowing, as though considering how to phrase the next part. A symbol of a great hero from ancient times, someone who struck fear into our enemies and brought peace to our race. The protagonist stared at her, stunned. This was madness. They had seen plenty of things on their travels, but this was something else entirely. They had never heard of the forgotten warrior, and yet here they were being marked by their symbol. Whoa.
Why would that symbol be on me?
The protagonist's voice was barely a whisper, more out of confusion than anything else. The Thoraxian's gaze shifted, a strange look crossing her features. It was a mix of wonder and something else. Something the protagonist couldn't quite place. "It is not on you by chance," she said, the words carrying a weight that felt heavy. "It is the sign of your destiny." For a moment, the protagonist stood frozen in place, trying to wrap their mind around the Thoraxian's words. They had simply been exploring, minding their own business. What did any of this have to do with them? They had no interest in being a figure of legend, no desire to lead anyone. They were a traveler, an explorer, not a warrior. But before they could voice any more doubts, the Thoraxian stepped closer, her eyes now focused on the protagonist. "You may not believe it now," she continued, "but the mark on your back is not just a tattoo. It's the symbol of a leader, a hero who will unite the broken tribes of the Thoraxians."
The protagonist felt a knot tighten in their stomach. This was absurd.
They didn't want to lead anyone. They weren't a hero. They were just someone who wanted to find their place in the vastness of space. But the Thoraxian's expression was unwavering. Her words seemed to carry a weight, a conviction that left no room for doubt. "The war between our tribes has raged for centuries.
Our people are divided, but you
are the one who can bring us together." The protagonist took a step back, shaking their head.
I'm not interested in your war. I came here to explore, to see new worlds."
"I didn't come to be anyone's savior." The Thoraxian's hand gripped her sword tighter, but there was no anger in her eyes, only a deep, unshakable certainty.
"The choice is not yours alone to make," she said firmly. "You have been chosen, whether you wish it or not. The tattoo you bear is not just a symbol. It is a call to action. You are the one who can end this bloodshed."
The protagonist's mind raced as they tried to process everything. They felt trapped.
How could they be the one to end a war they had no part in? They didn't even understand the Thoraxian culture. They barely understood why they had been brought here in the first place.
But the Thoraxian continued, her voice steady. "You may not see it now, but your arrival here is no coincidence. The prophecy spoke of a human with this mark, and it was foretold that they would lead our people to victory."
She paused, taking a deep breath. "You are the one who can unite the tribes and bring peace to our war-torn world." The protagonist opened their mouth to protest, but before they could speak, the ground beneath their feet trembled. A low rumble echoed through the valley, and the Thoraxian warrior's expression shifted from one of calm to one of alertness. "What was that?" the protagonist asked, their hand instinctively reaching for their blaster. The Thoraxian didn't answer at first. She was already moving, her hand raised, signaling the protagonist to follow her. "We are not alone," she said grimly. They both turned toward the horizon, where a dust storm was kicking up in the distance. But this wasn't a normal storm. The way the dust moved, the way it swirled, it wasn't natural. The Thoraxian warrior's eyes narrowed as she recognized the shape emerging from the cloud. A massive ship, dark and menacing, descended from the sky. Its silhouette loomed against the pale sky, casting a long shadow over the barren land. The Thraxian warrior clenched her fists, her eyes burning with rage. "The scorn," she muttered under her breath. "They've found us." The protagonist turned to her, confusion and fear flooding their chest.
"The scorn?"
They repeated, the name unfamiliar but carrying an ominous weight. "They are our enemies," she explained quickly. "They want to finish what they started centuries ago, to destroy our people once and for all." Her voice grew tense. "And now they've come for you." The protagonist looked at her, uncertainty clear on their face. "What do they want with me?" The Thraxian's eyes were full of cold determination. "They know about the mark. They know what it means." The rumble grew louder, and the sound of engines filled the air as the Scorn ship descended rapidly. Without hesitation, the Thraxian drew her blade, the weapon gleaming with a deadly light.
"We must move quickly."
"They will not stop until they have you." The protagonist felt a chill run down their spine. They had no idea what was happening, but one thing was clear. Whatever the mark on their back meant, it had just made them a target for a war they didn't understand. They had no choice now but to follow the Thraxian warrior into battle. The dust storm swirled around them, but the two figures remained unshaken. The protagonist could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them like never before. The ship in the distance was getting closer, its engines roaring as it cut through the air like a predator homing in on its prey. The Thraxian warrior stood firm, her eyes narrowing as she studied the descending craft. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice low and commanding. The protagonist's mind raced, trying to understand the gravity of the situation. They had barely gotten accustomed to this planet, let alone the revelation about the tattoo on their back. Now they were being chased by enemies who seemed to know more about them than they did themselves.
"What do they want with me?" the protagonist asked, their voice laced with confusion and concern. They had never imagined anything like this happening.
They had always been a wanderer, someone who moved from one adventure to the next, never involved in something bigger than themselves. But now, it felt as though the entire universe was focused on them. The Thraxian warrior glanced over her shoulder, her gaze fierce and resolute. "The Scorn are relentless," she said. "They are an ancient enemy of my people, and they've hunted us for centuries. We were driven into hiding, scattered across the galaxy, but they never stopped searching for us. And now, they've come for you." The protagonist frowned, still struggling to understand. "But why me? I'm just an explorer." "I don't even know what's going on. I don't understand any of this." The Thraxian warrior's gaze softened for a moment, her grip tightening around the hilt of her weapon.
"You carry the mark of the forgotten warrior."
"You are not just any human. The prophecy spoke of someone like you, a human marked by the ancients, who would unite our people and bring an end to the war. The Scorn know this. They believe you will be the key to their defeat, or to their ultimate victory." The words hit the protagonist like a shockwave. It was almost too much to comprehend. A simple tattoo had somehow made them the center of a war they had no part in, no understanding of. But before they could process any further, the Thraxian warrior moved swiftly, her movements practiced and precise. "We need to move. The Scorn will not hesitate. They've come for you, and they will stop at nothing to take you." With that, she started toward the jagged terrain, her feet kicking up dust as she moved with purpose. The protagonist hesitated for only a second before following her, instinctively grabbing their blaster and making sure it was within reach. Every step they took felt heavier than the last, the weight of responsibility pressing down on their shoulders. The terrain was harsh, the rocky outcrops casting long shadows in the fading light. They moved swiftly, the wind howling around them, but the ship was still getting closer, its engines roaring as it sliced through the atmosphere. The protagonist could feel their heart pounding in their chest, each thrum of adrenaline fueling their steps. "We'll make for the cliffs," the Thraxian warrior called back over her shoulder.
"It's the only way we'll have the high ground." We can't face them on open ground. The protagonist nodded, their breath coming faster as they pushed themselves harder.
The Thraxian moved like a shadow, her powerful legs carrying her effortlessly over the rough terrain. Despite the fear coursing through their veins, the protagonist couldn't help but feel a strange sense of awe as they watched her in action. She was a warrior, a true one, and there was something almost hypnotic in the way she moved. Her grace, her power, her absolute focus. The wind howled louder, and the sky above them darkened as the ship drew nearer. It was a massive craft, shaped like a bird of prey, with jagged wings and an angular design. It moved with a terrifying speed, cutting through the air as though it owned the sky. The Thraxian warrior didn't hesitate. She reached into a pouch at her waist and pulled out a small device, pressing a button that emitted a high-pitched beep.
"Are you sure about this?"
the protagonist asked, their voice a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. The warrior glanced at them over her shoulder. "We don't have a choice," she said. "The device will jam their sensors for a short time. It's our only chance." The protagonist nodded, though they didn't feel entirely confident. They didn't know how to fight a war they didn't understand, and they didn't feel like some chosen hero. They were just an ordinary person. An explorer, a traveler, trying to survive in a world far bigger than they had ever imagined. As they reached the foot of the cliffs, the ship overhead dropped lower, its engines screaming with power. The Thraxian warrior took a deep breath, her posture shifting as she assumed a defensive stance. "They're here," she whispered. The protagonist's stomach tightened. They could hear the faint hum of the ship's engines, feel the vibrations of the ground beneath their feet. They had to act fast. But what could they do? How could they possibly stand against an enemy that was so much more powerful than they were? Suddenly, a loud thud echoed across the landscape. The ship had landed just a few hundred yards away, its massive engines kicking up a cloud of dust as it settled into place. The ramp at the back of the ship began to lower, revealing a group of figures, tall, armored beings, their faces obscured by helmets. They stepped down, their movements precise, their weapons drawn and ready. The Thraxian warrior didn't move. She was as still as a statue, her eyes locked on the advancing enemy. The protagonist could feel the tension building, the air thick with anticipation. They could see the Scorn now, their heavy armor gleaming in the dimming light. These were the enemies who had hunted the Thraxians for centuries. These were the ones who had come for them. The first Scorn soldier raised their weapon, the energy blade glowing brightly in the fading sunlight. The Thraxian warrior stepped forward, her own weapon now raised, ready to face the oncoming threat. "Stay behind me," she ordered, her voice steady and calm. "I'll handle this." The protagonist hesitated for a moment, their heart pounding in their chest. The Thraxian warrior's words had an authority that made them want to obey without question. But part of them felt powerless, just a bystander in this conflict that had nothing to do with them. Before they could make a decision, the Scorn warrior charged. The blade in their hand crackled with energy as they swung it toward the Thraxian, a deadly strike aimed at her torso. But the warrior was faster. She blocked the strike with a swift movement, her own blade meeting the Scorn's with a loud clash. The battle was on. The protagonist stood frozen for a moment, watching as the two warriors clashed with an intensity that sent shockwaves through the air. The Thraxian moved like a force of nature, her strikes fluid and powerful. The Scorn soldier, though equally skilled, was slower, more deliberate, but there were more of them. Suddenly, another Scorn soldier charged in from the side, aiming their weapon at the protagonist. Without thinking, the protagonist raised their blaster, firing a quick shot that struck the Scorn soldier's arm, knocking the weapon from their hand. The Scorn soldier staggered back, growling in frustration. The Thraxian warrior glanced over her shoulder. "You have more courage than I thought," she said, a hint of approval in her voice. The protagonist didn't have time to respond. The battle was intensifying, and they were now fully involved in something far bigger than they had ever expected. The battle had become a blur of motion, energy blades crackling in the air, weapons clashing, and the hum of the Scorn ship's engines echoing in the distance. The protagonist felt a rush of adrenaline, but also a sense of disbelief. How had they gotten here? Just moments ago, they had been an explorer, lost in a foreign land, and now they were fighting for their life against an enemy they didn't even fully understand. The Thraxian warrior was a blur of action. She moved like lightning, her sword flashing through the air as she parried and struck with brutal efficiency. The Scorn soldiers were relentless, but they couldn't keep up with her speed and precision. Every movement she made was calculated, and it was clear she had been trained for this kind of combat her entire life. The protagonist, despite their confusion and fear, had found themselves instinctively stepping up to help. Their blaster was in their hand, and they fired shot after shot, hitting the Scorn soldiers with surprising accuracy. It wasn't much, but it was enough to create an opening for the Thraxian to strike again. The Scorn, however, were not easily defeated. They fought with a ruthless precision, coordinating their attacks as a team. The protagonist's heart raced as they ducked behind a boulder, narrowly avoiding a blast from one of the Scorn's energy rifles. Their breath came in shallow gasps, their minds spinning as they tried to make sense of the chaos around them. "Stay low!" the Thraxian warrior shouted, her voice cutting through the noise of the battle. She was holding her own, but there were too many of them. The Scorn were closing in. The protagonist nodded, taking cover behind the nearest rock. Their fingers tightened around the blaster, but they felt a surge of uncertainty. What were they doing here? How could they possibly help in a battle like this? "Don't stop shooting," the Thraxian called again, her voice firm. "We need to hold them off long enough to escape." Escape! The word hit the protagonist like a jolt of electricity.
That was the plan? To escape?
They hadn't even considered that option. For some reason, they had been caught up in this idea that they were meant to fight, to be the hero. But now that they were in the thick of it, the idea of running felt far more appealing. But they couldn't run. Not when the Thraxian warrior had already risked so much. They couldn't just leave her to fight alone. With a deep breath, the protagonist stood up from behind the rock, steadying their aim as they fired another shot. They took out one of the Scorn soldiers, and for a brief moment, the enemy's advance faltered. But the victory was short-lived. The remaining Scorn soldiers regrouped, and the battle raged on. The Thraxian warrior fought with a ferocity that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. She was unstoppable, her blade cutting through the air with deadly precision. But even she couldn't keep up forever. The Scorn were beginning to overwhelm her, pushing her back with coordinated attacks. "Fall back!" she ordered, her voice strained but commanding. "We can't win this fight!" The protagonist's heart sank as they saw her retreating, cutting through the Scorn soldiers with as much strength as she could muster. She was clearly skilled, but even she was outnumbered. The protagonist didn't want to back down, not after everything they had been through. But the Thraxian warrior wasn't giving up. She led the way as they ran, her movements fluid and graceful even in the midst of the chaos. The protagonist followed her, their legs aching as they pushed themselves harder, faster. The Scorn were relentless, but they couldn't catch up with them. They reached the cliffs, the steep walls rising sharply in front of them. The protagonist's breath came in ragged gasps, but they didn't stop. The Thraxian warrior had already scaled the first ledge, pulling herself up with a strength that seemed almost superhuman. "Hurry!" she called down, her voice full of urgency. "Get to the top!" The protagonist glanced behind them, seeing the Scorn closing in. They had no choice but to climb. Grabbing onto the nearest rock, they hauled themselves up, their fingers scraping against the rough surface. Every movement felt like it took an eternity, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. Once at the top, the Thraxian warrior didn't pause to catch her breath. She moved to the edge of the cliff, peering over it to assess the situation below. The protagonist stood beside her, their chest heaving as they tried to steady their breathing. "We're safe for now," the Thraxian said, though her voice was filled with a grim sense of resolve. She turned to face the protagonist, her eyes filled with an intensity that had not been there before.
We cannot keep running.
The scorn will never stop hunting us.
The protagonist swallowed hard, their heart pounding. They had escaped for the moment, but they knew it wouldn't last. The scorn would come again, and when they did, they would bring an even greater force.
What do we do now? The protagonist asked, their voice shaky.
What's the plan?
The Thraxian warrior looked at them, her expression softening for a moment.
The plan,
she said, is to confront them.
We can't keep running. We have to face them or they will destroy us all. The protagonist's mind raced. How could they possibly fight against the scorn?
They didn't have the skills, the knowledge, or the strength that the Thraxian warrior had. They were just one person, an explorer, who had stumbled into this mess by sheer chance. But the Thraxian was looking at them with such certainty that the protagonist felt something stir within them, a sense of purpose. They were no hero, but they had something the Thraxian needed. They had the mark of the forgotten warrior on their back, and that meant something. They had a role to play in this war, whether they wanted it or not.
Are you sure I'm the one?
The protagonist asked, their voice barely above a whisper.
I don't know anything about this. I don't know how to fight a war.
The Thraxian warrior placed a hand on their shoulder, her grip firm but comforting. You are the one, she said, her voice unwavering. The mark on your back is not just a symbol.
It is a call to action. The prophecy was never about a hero.
It was about someone who could bring unity, someone who could rally the Thraxian people together. And you, whether you know it or not, are that person. The protagonist felt a weight settle on their shoulders, but it wasn't just the burden of expectation. It was something else, a sense of responsibility, of knowing that they had to do something. They couldn't turn away from this. The Thraxian warrior continued, her eyes never leaving the protagonists. You don't have to do it alone. I'll fight beside you, and so will others. But the choice is yours. You can walk away, and the war will continue. Or you can stand with us, and we'll end it together. The protagonist looked out over the landscape, the sun setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the barren land. They thought about the journey they had taken to get here, the places they had been, the people they had met. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about something much bigger. They turned back to the Thraxian warrior, their eyes filled with determination.
I'll stand with you, they said, their voice steady. Let's end this war. The Thraxian warrior nodded, her expression one of respect and approval.
Together they turned and began the climb down the cliffs. The scorn were still out there, but now the protagonist knew what they had to do. The path ahead would be difficult, but they weren't alone, and that made all the difference.